What's going on, guys? Welcome to the 33rd Xamarin Annotator tutorial. And in this video, what we're going to be doing is taking a look at shared preferences, okay? So you may have noticed like the title shared preferences in the last few videos, and that's because those have been leading up to a good example of showing shared preferences and when and how to use them, okay? And shared preferences is simply a way to store data on the user's actual device, okay? So this becomes really useful in many situations, and one situation is the login screen, okay? And this is because when the user logs in, they can have the ability for the device to remember them. Therefore, the next time that they open up the application, they no longer have to log in manually. It'll do that for them based on the username and password that was stored on the device, okay? So to give an example of this, I'll go ahead and log in with a username and password, which are set to Joe and password right now. And I'll go ahead and check the remember me box, okay? And this will launch me into the normal application as usual. But now when I go ahead and kill the application on the Android OS and come back into the application, it will no longer take me to the login screen, but take me directly into the activity, okay? So this proves really useful, especially when a application is highly used by the user, and it would be really cumbersome to have them log in every single time. It's just really nice for them to give them the option to select, hey, log me in automatically and get me straight to the application, okay? So that's what shared preferences are for, and they're really useful for many other situations, but here's one situation where it's really useful and really a good way to give your application a more user-friendly feature, okay? So I'm going to go ahead and stop running this application, and we'll start on this application to get this working the way the other one was, okay? Now the first thing we want to do is we want to have a way for the user to be able to decide whether they want to be remembered by their device or not, okay? And that's using the checkbox that we have, okay? So we need to first grab a reference of it to be able to determine whether or not the checkbox is checked or not, okay? So let's come into our main XAML, or XML, and we will name this something a little more appropriate, like CVX remember me, okay? And you don't have to do this, but this is just a good way to keep track of what IDs belong to what, okay? So a little less generic and a little more specific. Now we'll come into our code, of course, and we'll need to grab a reference of that checkbox from the XML to our actual code, okay? And this is by the ID that we just gave it. So now that we have that, we can go ahead and check to see when the user actually logs in if they check the checkbox or not, okay? So we'll do if CVX is checked, then the user wants to have their preferences stored on their device, okay? So here we go. This is the way to do it, okay? So we do I shared preferences, okay? And this will store the preferences on the actual device, okay? It's the data, all right? And the way we can get an instance of that I shared preferences is to do application.context, and inside of that is a get shared preferences method, okay? And here it takes two parameters, and the string name is really important because of the fact that this is the collection that we'll make of user info, okay? So inside of user info, we can have lots of values that can hold lots of data. So user info is the way to reference it, okay? And of course, if it doesn't exist, it will create a shared preference called user info. And the file creation mode we want is private, okay? And we want private because here you'll see it says the created file can only be accessed by calling the application, by the calling application. So this means that the application, our application, is the only one that can access this shared preference, okay? So other applications on the user's Android phone cannot access this, okay? So that's exactly what we want. Next, we need to get I shared preferences editor, and we can do that by using preference.edit, okay? And that will return an editor of type I shared preferences editor, okay? So which is exactly what we want. So now that this will enable us to edit anything, okay, inside of the preferences, okay? And this is what we want to store. So this is actually about the values that we want to store inside on the device, okay? So this is a key value pair, guys. And these names are important because this is the key that we're going to reference when we actually want to get the value, okay? So the first one's going to be username, is going to be the key, and the value is going to be the username that the user inputted in the edit text on the login screen, okay? The next thing we're going to want to get is the password, okay? We're going to want to store the password, okay? And here we'll need to grab a reference to the edit text that is the password box. So we'll do it the same way that we did the checkbox, except that this is an edit text and the ID should be txt password. Okay, guys? So if we come down here, we can do mPassword.text and we'll trim any trailing white space. Okay, so now this will take and this will put the username and password with the key value of username and password onto the device. Okay, and the last thing we want to do is do edit.apply, and this will actually apply these puts. Okay, so if you don't do this, none of this will actually be applied. So make sure you do edit.apply. And now what will happen is when the user checks this, it'll store this on the device. Okay, so what we want to do, guys, is we want to have another activity. Okay, we're going to want an activity that's called and it delegates what activity to call depending on if the user stored the information or not. Okay, so let's do new item and we'll call this the splash for like a splash page. Okay, so since we want this to be the first activity to launch, we'll need to specify that here in main launcher equals true. Okay, and we'll want to come into the main activity, our login activity, and we'll want to take that away from it. Okay, so we no longer want this to be the main activity, since if the user has saved credentials, we may want to go this activity first, but if they don't, we may want to go to this activity first. So this activity, splash, is the one that delegates and controls what's going where. Okay, so here we'll do iShared preferences like we did in main activity. In the same way, we want to use the get shared preferences method. Okay, and make sure this is the same exact string, user info. Okay, so this will grab our collection of shared preferences, the user info. If it doesn't exist, then it'll create it. Okay, so make sure that that's the same. And what we'll have here is we'll have our username and password that is stored on the device. And at this point, guys, we don't know if the user has anything stored on the device. Okay, but what we can do is we can do preferences.getString, and we want to give it the key. Okay, the key being, remember what we stored here. So here's our username key, here's our password key, username right here. And the second parameter is our default value. So our default value is if there doesn't exist a username key, maybe the user didn't save anything. If there wasn't anything saved, then it'll default to string, the empty string. Okay, and this is the same as doing this and string.empty. Okay, so we'll just do it a little bit of a fancier way. We want to do the same thing for the password. Our key was password, and our default will be the empty string. Okay, guys, so now that we have our username and password, which may or may not be empty, we want to check to see if it's empty or not. Okay, so if it equals string.empty, or if the password equals string.empty, that means that the user hasn't saved anything. Okay, there's nothing really useful inside of that. Either it's not there or it's just not useful stuff. Okay, so let's go ahead and comment that. No saved credentials. Take user to the login screen. Okay, so now our splash activity will start a new intent to take the user to the login screen because they don't have any saved credentials. Okay, so that will do that. Okay, otherwise there are saved credentials. Okay, So just because they're saved to credentials doesn't necessarily mean that they are correct, okay? So the username and password may have changed in some time and it might be old data, or they may have entered in something wrong, okay? So back over here, guys, the password, of course, if you're using this for a real application, the password just as a device should be encrypted, okay? So this is just plain text, and if you're going to store anything on the phone, just in case, it's a good idea to encrypt it. However, that obviously extends the scope of this tutorial, but just for good reference, just make sure that you encrypt this password if you're going to store it on the device, okay? Now that being said, let's come over here and comment this and say this: there are saved credentials, okay? So here is where you would more than likely, this is where you would query the database, okay? This is where you would query the database. But we don't have any sort of database set up right now. So if you do have a database set up, then you can use that username and password to go ahead and query the database to make sure that they are correct. And if they are, you'll log in the user, okay? So if the username equals whatever the database sent back, but in my case, I'm just going to use a fixed value because of the fact that the application is local. It's not using a database right now. So if it is the username and password is the password, if there exists on the database, okay, so the username and password would go into the database and then it would send back I would imagine a username and password that would send back, okay? So if it did, then you can say if successful, okay? So then you can have a variable said, you would just say if successful, like a Boolean or something like that. But since I don't have that, I'm just gonna go ahead and say if username equals Joe and if password equals password, okay? So here we'll just say successful, take the user to application. Okay, so the user has logged in successfully, okay? In that case, we want to take them to the main activity, okay? The activity that actually, not the main activity, but the activity that is beyond the login screens, okay? So all of the features of the activity, of the application. Okay, so now we want to come after here, we'll start the activity, send the intent, and we want to create another else, okay? So this is if the username had some shared credentials, right? But they didn't work, okay? So take user to login screen. So they had some credentials that came into here and it said, okay, if username equals string empty or password empty, then do this. Otherwise, okay, there are saved credentials. And then it came into here and it said, okay, wait, so username does not equal Joe and does not equal password, and it wasn't successful. We queried the database, but there is no existing username and password with that specified username and password. So let's come into here and say it's unsuccessful, okay? So what we want to do now is we want to again take them to the login screen. And let's start the activity with that intent. And then we're going to want to finish this activity so the user cannot go back to the splash activity. All right. So now before we do that though, let's go over here. So if there was stored credentials and they obviously didn't work, then we're probably going to want to clear them. Okay. So this is a good situation in which we can clear. I can show you how to clear the data. Okay. So you do preferences.edit. Okay, so that'll return the shared preferences editor, and you simply just do edit.clear, okay? And see that the IntelliSense says mark in the editor to remove all values from the preferences, okay? And then of course apply. So that will remove anything inside of the of the preferences, okay? And since it's just the username and password, we can just clear everything, okay? And that's because this must be bad data since there was data here, but there's something that exists with that username and password in the database. So let's just go ahead and clear it. That way the user can just log in immediately since they won't have any good shared preferences, okay? All right, so let's go ahead and run this, guys. And I do expect an error to happen, but I will show you after how to fix it. But something that usually when you see an error, sometimes what happens is it becomes more apparent to why to add that code in because of the fact that you should fix it, okay? So let's first log in. Okay, and let's make sure that we click the Remember Me button. And it'll log us in just as normal, okay? So now if we close the application and reopen it, it should come into here and see that we have some saved preferences now because of the main activity should have stored it. And it should come into our username and password and then give us an error. And it tried to do that, but it came into activity 2 and then it had no username intent inside of the intent, okay? So remember in the last activity, guys, what we did was we pushed an intent, we put an extra string that was a serialized JSON string with a key name of user, okay? So that way activity 2 comes into here and it says, okay, user with the key name user from the intent, and then it deserializes the string in the course and then it turns it into a user object for .NET, okay? So basically the what's going on is there is no user string, okay, with that key. And that's because it wasn't called from here. Remember that it was called from over here now because there was saved preferences. So it came into here and it said, okay, username is Joe, password is password, and I'll call the intent. But we didn't set an intent here, okay? And that's because, we just didn't do it. So that way, so that it came into here in activity 2 and it just didn't work, okay? It didn't exist. So that's an easy fix, guys. All we need to do is we just need to copy and paste this code over here. Okay. And at this point, it will be username, password, and then what we want to do is put an intent, put extra inside of the intent, okay? And if you guys aren't following along exactly what I'm doing, I did this in the last tutorial, so if you haven't watched that one, just go back one tutorial, and that's where I'll explain everything that's going on right here, okay? But now the JSON, now it will serialize the string into a JSON, or to the object into a JSON string with this key name of user. That way when it comes over here, it'll work just fine, okay? So now let's go ahead and try it one more time. So what we should expect to happen is it should come into here again, call the activity, and take us straight into the activity 2. And there you go, guys. That's all. So that's it. And then now, of course, what you'd want to do in the future, if you're gonna have shared preferences in your application, you're probably gonna want to have like a settings button or something down here that will allow the user to be able to clear their settings. Okay, so you can clear the preferences, okay? But as I showed right here, if you want to do it inside of the code, just come in and anywhere in the code, just do this, and also this first, and then this, and that'll clear anything that you have stored on the device, okay? And one last thing, guys, if you guys are using an emulator, be sure to come into Tools, Options, and down at the bottom here, Xamarin. Make sure that you check this box on, okay? So make sure this is checked. And this is preserving application data and cache on the device between deploys. So if you don't have that checked, what will happen is you'll store something on device, but after every deploy, it erases. So then it'll be like it's not working and you'll probably be like, what the heck, what's going on? If you're using a normal device, like your own phone, then that's okay. But if you're using a emulator like I am, make sure you have this checked. That way you'll be preserving the application data between deploys. Okay, so make sure that is checked. All right, so that's pretty much it now, guys. I mean, this is going to be a nice feature for you to have if you guys are doing some kind of login activity, and this will make it a good feature to make it a lot more user friendly for the user to be able to log in and out of your application. Okay, so as always, thanks for watching, guys.